In 2019, a young soldier named Gregory Morales vanished just days before leaving the army. His car was found months later, his name labeled a deserter, and his family left with unanswered questions. A year later, his remains surfaced in a Texas field. Was it foul play? And why did it take so long to uncover the truth? This is the story that shook Fort Hood and raised questions about safety within the military. He was only 24, standing on the edge of a new life. Private Gregory Morales had served his time, and within days he was supposed to leave Fort Hood, Texas behind. Friends and family say he was excited, ready to begin the next chapter, away from the discipline and uncertainty of military life. But on August 19, 2019, he simply vanished. The last confirmed sighting placed him just outside the gates of Fort Hood, in the city of Killeen. After that, silence. No calls, no texts, no sign of where he might have gone. For those who knew him, this sudden disappearance didn't feel like a choice. It felt like something had gone terribly wrong. Months passed before his car turned up, sitting abandoned. Instead of answers, the army declared him a deserter. That label stung. To his loved ones, it felt like more than a mistake. It felt like betrayal. They insisted he would never abandon his duty like that. Not when he was so close to finishing his service honorably. Still, questions piled up. Why had the search been so slow? Why was the story framed as if Gregory had simply run away? For nearly a year, the mystery dragged on. Then, on June 19, 2020, everything changed. A tip led investigators to an open field in Killeen, just a short drive from the base. There, hidden in the grass, they found human remains. They were Gregory's. And with that discovery, the narrative shifted. No longer a deserter, now a victim. Investigators determined foul play was likely. But by then, the trail was cold. Who wanted him gone? Who silenced him right as his army chapter was closing? And why had it taken so long for anyone to listen? The story of Gregory Morales is not only about one man's tragic end. It's about the cracks inside one of the largest military installations in America, and the haunting question that lingers even today. How many more stories like his remain untold? They said foul play was likely. Those words carried weight, but they also carried frustration, because by the time Gregory's body was found, months had slipped away, evidence had grown cold, and trust between his family and the army had fractured beyond repair. For almost a year, his mother and loved ones had begged officials not to dismiss him as a deserter. They argued he had plans, he had hope, and no reason to run. But inside the system, it was easier to place a label on him than to search for the truth. That label became a wall, and behind it, precious time was lost. When investigators finally stood in that field in June of 2020, staring at the place where Gregory's story ended, the silence was deafening. What had happened here? Who had led him to this lonely patch of ground? There were no obvious answers, only a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death can be. And then, almost as if fate itself was speaking, the timing collided with another case, one that would soon dominate national headlines. The disappearance of Specialist Vanessa Guillen, another Fort Hood soldier who went missing in April of 2020. Her story, too, raised alarms about the culture on base, about accountability, and about whether soldiers were truly safe in their own ranks. Suddenly, Gregory's case was no longer just a tragedy whispered in his hometown. It was pulled into a larger storm of outrage, a spotlight shining directly on Fort Hood. Journalists, advocates, and even lawmakers began asking the same questions his family had asked for nearly a year. Why wasn't he taken seriously? Why did it take so long to bring him home? The discovery of his remains wasn't closure. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with public pressure, unanswered questions, and the haunting possibility that his story was not an isolated incident. Because if Gregory could vanish, be misclassified, and then found in a field, who else might be lost, waiting for someone to demand the truth? Public outrage brought Gregory's name back into the conversation, but behind every headline was a grieving family who had spent months screaming into the void. They wanted justice, yes, but even more than that, they wanted acknowledgement that their son, their brother, their loved one was not a deserter, not a runaway, but a soldier who had been failed by the very institution meant to protect him. The army eventually corrected its records, restoring Gregory's honor, but the damage had already been done. For months, his obituary had been stained by a label he didn't deserve, and his family had carried the burden of fighting both grief and stigma. That kind of wound doesn't heal quickly. It lingers, quietly reminding everyone that trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Investigators confirmed what the family suspected all along: foul play. But the details stopped there. No clear suspect, no motive, no timeline that made sense. Just fragments. And in true crime, fragments are both haunting and dangerous. They leave room for speculation, rumors, and theories that swirl without solid ground. Meanwhile, as Gregory's case was being reopened in the public eye, Vanessa Guillen's disappearance began drawing thousands of voices demanding accountability. Protests spread beyond Texas, echoing across the country. Gregory's name was spoken alongside hers, not because their stories were identical, but because together they painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Fort Hood, once known simply as a massive military installation, was now being spoken of in terms of mystery, violence, and mistrust. People asked, how many other soldiers had slipped through the cracks? How many families had been silenced or misled? Gregory's story no longer lived in isolation. It had become a symbol, a piece of a much larger puzzle. And with that shift, the search for answers was no longer just about one man. It was about confronting a system that many feared was broken at its core. The more attention Gregory's case received, the more uncomfortable questions emerged. Why had it taken a civilian tip to lead authorities to his remains? Why did investigators wait nearly a year to treat his disappearance as suspicious? These weren't minor oversights. They were failures that suggested something deeper, a breakdown in how the system valued its own soldiers. For his family, the discovery brought no closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter of grief. They had spent months being told their son had walked away, that he had turned his back on his duty, and now, faced with the evidence of foul play, they were left to wonder if a proper investigation from the very beginning might have changed everything. As these questions spread, the national media began connecting dots. Vanessa Guillen's disappearance was sparking protests, candlelight vigils, and waves of social media campaigns. And every time her name was mentioned, Gregory's story appeared alongside it, like two shadows cast by the same failing light. The pressure grew heavy on Fort Hood. Families of soldiers began to speak up, sharing their own fears and frustrations. Lawmakers called for reviews, independent panels, and oversight. It became clear this wasn't about one missing soldier, or even two. It was about a culture where silence and delay had become the norm. Gregory's memory was reshaped in that moment. He was no longer seen through the false label of deserter. Instead, he became a face in a movement demanding change, a reminder that behind every headline was a real person, with a life cut short and a family left behind. And yet, through all of this renewed attention, one truth remained frustratingly constant. No arrests had been made. Whoever was responsible for ending his life had slipped away quietly, hidden by time, silence, or perhaps by protection. That fact alone kept the wound open, because the question that echoed louder than ever was not just how Gregory had died, But why justice seems so far out of reach? The unanswered questions around Gregory's death lingered like an open wound. For every new report, for every panel discussion on Fort Hood, his family still faced the same reality. No arrests, no names, no justice. The official word was foul play, but that phrase only scratched the surface. What happened on the night he vanished? Who lured him away from safety? And why did the trail grow so cold, so quickly? The frustrating truth is that once a case stalls, silence becomes its own barrier. Witnesses grow hesitant, memories fade, and rumors begin to replace facts. In Gregory's case, the silence was heavy. Investigators offered little detail, citing the sensitivity of the case. But to the outside world, it felt like yet another wall going up, blocking the truth rather than pursuing it. This lack of clarity fueled speculation. Was it someone from outside the army? Was it someone inside? Had Gregory seen something he wasn't supposed to see? Or was he caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? True crime stories often hinge on motives, but here, the motive remained hidden, like a piece missing from the puzzle. Meanwhile, Gregory's story became part of a larger call for reform. Advocates argued that his case, alongside others, showed systemic flaws in how missing soldiers were investigated. Civilian agencies and military authorities clashed over jurisdiction, often leaving families stuck in the middle, waiting for answers that never came. The tragedy is that Gregory should have been days away from discharge. He should have been free, moving toward a new future. Instead, his life ended in a field, and the mystery of how it happened continues to overshadow his memory. And as public pressure built, one haunting question followed every headline. If this could happen to Gregory, if this could happen to Vanessa, then who would be next? The storm around Fort Hood only grew louder. Gregory's case and Vanessa Guillen's case collided into a single wave of outrage, one that reached far beyond Texas. For the first time in years, the public was openly questioning how America's military handled its own. Protests gathered outside the gates, families demanded change on live television, and lawmakers began asking hard questions about accountability. Inside the halls of power, reviews were launched. Independent panels were assigned to study the climate at Fort Hood, and what they found was alarming. A culture marked by fear, mistrust, and a pattern of dismissing soldier complaints. Soldiers had been reporting harassment, assaults, and safety concerns, but too often, their voices were buried beneath bureaucracy. Gregory's disappearance fit into that disturbing pattern. Not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of something bigger. For his family, these findings were both validating and heartbreaking. They had always believed Gregory deserved better, that his case had been mishandled from the very beginning. Now, official reports confirmed what they had been saying for months. Still, the validation did little to ease the loss. The truth was clear, but justice remained distant. As pressure mounted, the Army promised reforms. New leadership was installed, investigations into command practices began, and promises of change echoed through press conferences. Yet for families like Gregory's, words were never enough. They had been told to wait before, and waiting had cost them everything. In the end, Gregory's name became more than a headline. It became a rallying cry, a reminder that behind every statistic was a human life, full of dreams, cut short without explanation. His story joined a growing chorus demanding not just accountability, but transparency, compassion, and above all, prevention, so that no other soldier would vanish and be forgotten. But even with reforms promised, the lingering question remained. Would real change actually come? Or would Gregory's story fade into yet another unsolved chapter in Fort Hood's troubled history? Across the country, families of service members were watching Gregory's story unfold, and many saw pieces of their own fears reflected in it. For parents who had sent their sons and daughters into the Army, The assumption was always that discipline, structure, and duty would protect them. But now the cracks were visible. If a soldier could disappear and be written off as a deserter, what did that mean for everyone else still serving? Military life has always carried risks. Deployments to war zones, grueling training, long separations from loved ones. Those are sacrifices soldiers and families accept. But the idea that danger could come from within, that a soldier could vanish on home soil and be left unsearched for, that was harder to accept. Gregory's story became a cautionary tale, whispered in conversations among military spouses and quietly discussed by soldiers who no longer felt entirely safe in their own barracks. Trust, once shaken, spreads quickly. Civilian communities near Fort Hood began raising their voices as well, questioning how much had been hidden from the public. News outlets picked up story after story of misconduct, mishandled investigations, and a culture that seemed more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting its people. Gregory's case highlighted something bigger than one tragedy. It revealed the fragile contract between service members and the institution they serve. That contract promises loyalty, protection, and honor. But when his disappearance was mislabeled, when his family's pleas were ignored, that promise was broken. For the Morales family, the pain was personal. For the rest of the nation, it became symbolic. His story was no longer just about a soldier lost in Killeen, Texas. It was about whether the system designed to safeguard the guardians of freedom was capable of safeguarding them at all. And as the pressure built, it became clear that the Army could not simply move on. Gregory's name, along with Vanessa's, had become too powerful, too loud, too symbolic to be forgotten.
The national attention could not be ignored. Gregory's case, paired with Vanessa's, forced the Army to open its doors to scrutiny in a way it rarely had before. Panels of investigators descended on Fort Hood, interviewing soldiers, reviewing records, and piecing together a portrait of daily life on base. What they uncovered confirmed what families had long suspected. This wasn't just about two isolated tragedies. It was about a culture where fear, silence, and neglect had taken root. The report was blunt. Soldiers described an environment where harassment was overlooked, where reporting misconduct often led to retaliation rather than protection. Cases went uninvestigated, complaints were brushed aside, and leadership failed to create a climate of trust. For Gregory's family, these findings hit hard. They didn't bring him back, but they validated every cry, every insistence that something had gone terribly wrong. Civilian leaders called the revelations shocking, but for those who lived at Fort Hood, they were not surprising. The system had been failing from within for years, and Gregory's disappearance was one of many warning signs ignored until it was too late. Reforms were promised. Commanders were relieved of duty. Policies were rewritten, and new training programs were rolled out. Yet change on paper doesn't always mean change on the ground. Families wondered, would these promises actually protect soldiers, or were they just meant to quiet the outrage until the spotlight moved on? Gregory's case had become more than an unsolved crime. It had become evidence. Evidence that the institution tasked with defending a nation had struggled to defend its own. And while his name was now linked to reforms and accountability, one fact still remained painfully clear. His killer, or killers, were still free. That absence of justice kept the story alive, fueling the belief that reform without resolution would never be enough. Because real closure, both for his family and for the public, required more than reports. It required answers. Even after reports were published and reforms were announced, the central mystery of Gregory's death refused to fade. For investigators, the official line remained the same. Foul play was suspected,
But suspicion is not the same as resolution. No arrests, no charges, no names released to the public. Just an open-ended case, lingering like an unfinished sentence. This silence created space for theories. Some whispered that Gregory might have trusted the wrong people, pulled into a situation that spiraled out of control. Others wondered if his death was connected to larger issues at Fort Hood, part of a hidden pattern too dangerous to speak about openly. And then there were those who feared the truth was buried deeper, protected by the very system meant to expose it. For his family, these theories offered no comfort. They didn't want speculation. They wanted facts. They wanted a timeline of what happened the night he disappeared, answers about why his car sat abandoned for months, and above all, accountability for whoever left him in that field. What made the frustration sharper was the timing. Gregory was on the verge of discharge, ready to start fresh. He had plans, goals, and reasons to look forward. That reality made the idea of him simply vanishing on his own even more impossible. Every detail pointed back to the same truth. Someone else played a role in his death. The lack of resolution also left a deeper scar. Without justice, without closure, the reforms that followed felt incomplete. They addressed culture, they addressed leadership, but they didn't answer the most human question at the heart of it all. Who took Gregory's life, and why? And so, his story remains suspended. Part reform, part mystery, part haunting reminder that behind every headline is a family still waiting for a phone call, a confession, a break in the silence that has lasted far too long. Because until that moment comes, the story of Gregory Morales will never truly be over. Gregory's name now lives in a space between tragedy and legacy. He was more than a headline, more than a soldier who disappeared. He was a son, a brother, a man preparing to begin a new life, just as his old one was ending. That is the detail that cuts deepest. He wasn't lost overseas in combat. He wasn't taken by an accident of war. He was lost here, on American soil, in a place that was supposed to protect him. His story, tied so closely to Vanessa Guillen's, forced an institution to face its own reflection. Fort Hood was no longer just a base. It became a symbol of everything that needed to change. And for a brief moment, the country listened. People who had never stepped foot on a military installation began to understand that safety for soldiers isn't guaranteed by the size of the base or the strength of its gates. It depends on trust, accountability, and leadership. But symbols can fade if memory fades with them. For Gregory's family, the work is not only about seeking justice, but about keeping his story alive. They remind the world that behind military uniforms are human beings with dreams, with families who wait for them to come home. When one of them is silenced, it is not just a personal loss. It is a national responsibility. The reforms, the investigations, the promises of change, these are necessary steps, but they do not erase the haunting absence of an answer to the simplest question. Who took Gregory's life? Until that truth is uncovered, his story remains unfinished. And maybe that is why his name continues to echo, not just because of what was lost, but because of what still needs to be found. Gregory Morales should have been discharged with honor. Instead, he became a reminder that honor must also come in how we treat those who serve, especially when their voices can no longer speak for themselves. The story of Gregory Morales is not over. It waits, quietly, insistently, for justice. If this story moved you and you want to hear more true crime cases like Gregory's, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that the names of those we've lost are never forgotten. Thank you for listening.